Peace, family.
Good morning.
Welcome. Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to everyone that's viewing, tuning in to another episode of We Charge Colonialism podcast and book club. Happy to be here and to have another discussion. I'm Ikemba, member of the Public Relations Committee.
Hey, y'all. I am Tierney. I am the steering committee chair for We Charge Colonialism.
All right. And Frank, who's usually with us, can't be with us today, but wishing him a speedy recovery. I can't wait to have him back. So We Charge Colonialism podcast and book club, and our purpose is to definitely educate and to bring the news of our people all around the world, the conditions of our people to light, giving you the perspective or the view from the freedom fighters' perspective rather than the colonial perspective. So, it's our intention to counter all the false information that's put out there that's dealing with African people. I'm excited. We're transitioning into a new book today. We're going to be reading from Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So we're going to get into that later, starting from chapter 1. So everyone should have access to that. If you don't have the book, we should have a link for you so you can read along with us. Also, I want to suggest that people send us some book suggestions as well. If you have any PDFs, any books that you think that we should cover, you can send that our way and we can put it on the list.
We saw one on our last video, so I'll send that over to you. See if you can look at it.
Okay, that's what's up. Yeah. That way, because I'm definitely looking for some more African women writers and analysts. More African women writers. Yeah. I'm definitely take any suggestions for that you have for that. So we're gonna start off like we usually start off with our weekly roundup. So Habari Ghani, what's the news, Tia?
So I wanted to talk about Miss Hattie shared a really interesting story. I thought it was interesting because the United Nations, just happened, had their big, conference in the last couple of weeks, and Ethiopia, just in the last few days, has expelled the United Nations, a few United Nations officials from Ethiopia, saying that the UN has been trying to destabilize that country and basically meddling inside of their affairs. They specifically accused I think it was the humanitarian aid chair inside of the United Nations. So it's very interesting because, I just did a video on my channel. I was just talking about so many things the United Nations has done. Just the interesting thing about them is to see how they navigate when they will step into something and when they won't. Overwhelmingly, they don't try to get involved inside a country's affairs, even when we know that they are outrightly collaborating with imperialism and outrightly doing things that could jeopardize the people. We really don't see the United Nations get involved in too many affairs, but sometimes they do. In Ethiopia and the Eritrea and TPLF conflict is when the United Nations has decided to step in. So it's also interesting because it's kind of being pitched as, Ethiopia is trying to stop humanitarian aid from getting to their adversaries. That's the reason that they're expelling them. But Ethiopians are saying, no, we just don't want you meddling in our affairs. We feel like you are regime change agents and you're no longer welcomed here. So I'm always a fan whenever countries decide that they want to split off from the aid organizations, UNICEF, USAID, all of these aid organizations that we know are not meant for independence, but they're really meant for dependence of sovereign nations. So I'm always a fan of that. So I'm just interested to see what's going to come of this. Is this going to lead to sanctions or more actions against Ethiopia? It's very interesting again to see how it's being framed inside of the media as basically they're trying to starve out the TPLF by doing this. So I don't know. What are your thoughts, Ikemba? I know you talked about this story a lot of times.
Yeah, when it comes to the UN, I think like last week, you showed the video or something, right? Or a picture. I know you showed like a UN truck turned over, and just like with resource. I can't remember. Say that again.
Sorry, with minerals. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so UN involvement in any of these countries, African countries, I look at with a side eye, just because of just like who really has this control over the United Nations when it comes to the dispensing of resources, and when you talk about dependency, dependency on UN aid is almost equivalent on dependency on Western aid. When I look at it, because if you look at even the history to set up the United Nations and who really wields the most power when it comes to the United Nations, it's the Western countries, and including, and I guess we can include China and Russia in that because they're part of the Security Council. But for the most part, though, it's those countries like Britain, France, in the United States of America. Even when it comes to the IMF and World Bank, those institutions right there, even though all countries have a vote in those institutions, it goes by weighted. It goes by weighted voting. So the countries who put the most money in, resources in, have the most say on how resources are allocated. So with that being said, the poorer nations really don't have too much input, if any, when it comes to how those resources are used. And so, and that's why I say like this dependency really that African countries have on UN aid gives the Western nations, European nations, and the United States, it gives them let's say, more influence on the decision making in those countries. And Ethiopia is heavily influenced on UN aid. So, like I think, for one, the African Union, who has these internal contradictions, if they're really going to represent African countries, they're going to have to step their game up. You know what I'm saying? African countries shouldn't have to go outside of Africa for assistance and help.
And the ironic thing, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The ironic thing, like you mentioned, the African Union. The African Union is funded by the countries, same Western countries. So, I was trying to look for it, but I couldn't find it. But I did show this chart on my channel that breaks down like the funders of the United Nations, and it's overwhelmingly the Western countries. The United States being number one, and we know how the U.S. operates. They don't invest in something unless they see a return on that investment. So the fact that they are putting so much money into the United Nations, they know that gives them the most say, and they know that gives them the most influence, and they know that ultimately it's going to come back in their favor. So yes, the United Nations, it's just such a contradiction, and I think more and more there's frustration growing among Africans because one, we know that it's not even like democratically set up, like the way that they have the Security Council and then the general body, that's everyone, but only 5 countries make all the decisions. So it's not even democratically set up. But then on top of that, like they outrightly ignore the many atrocities by Western governments and only step in whenever it seems as though their Western interests could be upset by some type of conflict. And so, I feel like the consciousness of like this institution has to be completely just discarded. I think that like consciousness is just rising among many Africans the more that they realize these contradictions.
Yeah, and I think like the more control that Africans get over their resources, it's going to give them more power to or the ability to separate themselves from these foreign powers. And so, because that's what it's about. Like, I mean, right now, it's a protracted struggle. But what's going to need to happen though is that even though you'll see more and more African people rising out of poverty, are they going to continue to work in the interest though of those foreign powers, or work in the interest of the African working class? Because the last thing we need is for sort of just this like replacement of the colonialists with a new a new uh, regime of colonialists in Africa. And I know we're dealing with the neo-colonialists, but I'm saying if there's this separation and African people are in control of their destiny, do they have institutions and structures set up that's going to represent all of the people, that's going to benefit all of the people? Or is it just going to be a continuation of the exploitation of the masses by a minority? And so, that's something that we have to really look out for. Because even in Ethiopia, we talk about, this struggle. For me, I'm looking at it, I'm like, yo, this is a struggle between, the bourgeois right here, and the masses of people are getting, caught up in that.
And I want to add in something like about the UN. I think that the conversation, has to be turned to like, what's the alternative? Because we do need like an international mediator, obviously, when it comes to working out, or ensuring that certain actors are not stepping out of bounds. But this is not the body that's doing it. They're just shown over and over again that this is not what they're going to be doing. And one thing that I think we should start questioning is like when we have these conversations about well, we need to stand for our human rights and appeal to UN and everything like that. Like, what's the alternative? Is there another way, another formation that we can create that we can appeal to? Because ultimately, even the human rights scheme is determined by the oppressors. There's some rights that aren't even recognized that we would recognize. Like I would recognize economic rights. Like we should all have rights to not be poor. We should all have a right to not be landless. That's not recognized in an international scheme, because every time that those types of rights were suggested, the Western powers, most mainly US, UK, France, they all came out against it. So there's always been like this tug of war with what we recognize as human rights and what actually is like suited to better the lives of African people. So there's a necessary conversation that has to be had about what are we going to do if we do need a body to appeal to, and if the United Nations is not going to be that body. So how are we going to organize to meet our own needs? And we've seen like institutions like the non-alignment movement form up in the past to try to push that agenda. But once again, like we have to do that again, because now like the media is controlling so much. So it seems like a lot of our people were not aware of the fact that we have this legacy of human rights that are alternative human rights institutions. But, we have to become awakened to that and organize appropriately.
Yeah, I agree. And what I think what we have to start doing, and I guess this is why these podcasts are so important. The videos that we do are so important as far as the educational process of getting us to think outside of colonial education, getting us to, and colonial indoctrination, I should say, because we have to begin to visualize institutions in a world outside of what we're used to. We've been so because we're born into this, and this is all that we know. So once we can begin to think and be like, hey, nobody should be without land, nobody should be without housing, food, and we have the capability to be able to address all of the needs of people around the world. And we sort of got this thinking of scarce resources. Now, people have to, earn it. And so it's just like, man, like if people, so if people are in situations where they don't have the capability or ability to do it because of institutions that are exploiting and oppressing them, so what, we just starve them to death? Or they just remain landless? Like, no, if anything, that should be the basic foundation that we build everything else upon. Everybody has their basic needs, and now let's build upon that. But it's going to take a struggle against the elitists who, for thousands of years, have been in control of these institutions that taken on different forms. Before colonial capitalism, there still was an elite. The system prior to that, there still was an elite that was in control of masses of people, and so it just took a different form. But yeah, that's going down another rabbit hole right there. So I'm a transition the conversation, but kind of stay on the same topic when we're talking about land, sovereignty, and control. Excuse me. I wish I had some water before we got started. But We'll move over to South Sudan and what's happening in Southern Sudan at the moment. And I kind of wanted to just touch on this topic because we don't talk a lot about South Sudan. And I want to put, just make sure that we are staying conscious of what's taking place in that country as we talk about, really talk about all of the countries of Africa. But I think this country, who's a newly formed country, when we need to keep an eye out on that, because I'm eyeing on them because, for one, Southern Sudan could represent this sort of model of what other African countries can do. But unfortunately, they haven't been able to, they really have been wasting their time in the last 10 years since they won their independence or gained their independence in 2011.
10 years? Oh, wow. I thought it was like 3 years ago.
Yeah, hey, it did go fast. It went really fast. But since 2011, they have been a separate state. And but in 2013, they devolved into a civil war, unfortunately. So 2 years later, after winning their independence or gaining, state sovereignty, they devolved into a civil war where you have like these divisions on ethnic lines, and it's sad that and it's just not. The thing is like we talk about like these ethnic conflicts, but it's bigger than just like these people being of different ethnic groups. It's a struggle over resources, right? And who's controlling these resources. And so at the end of the day, if the resources was able to benefit all, which they should be able to benefit all the people of Southern Sudan, there wouldn't be a conflict. And they're really trying to figure out a way now to have these resources benefit all the people. But so when you look at who the resources are going to, who's in control of those resources, like China, they're dependent on Beijing right now. As far as oil, because Southern Sudan is an oil producing company, and Beijing is like their largest, or Southern Sudan is supplying Beijing with oil. So it's that relationship right there. So we got to look at now, what is China's foreign policy? What are they doing in Southern Sudan? This is something that we have to keep an eye on. And what are they doing to sort of help resolve this conflict, if anything, which we could probably surmise that they're not doing anything. As long as they can get oil, they're cool, with it. There's also been an arms embargo on Southern Sudan. And I raised that just to show, like, once again, now there's this dependency, because they're saying, like, we need arms and we can't get in the arms. We can't even get a pistol in Southern Sudan. But at the end of the day, it's like now there's the dependency on other countries to arm them so that they can, be able to secure themselves. And then there's the dependency on other countries to be able to sell their oil to outside of the African continent. And so when you have this dependency, there's going to be a struggle, because there's going to be people who are like, whoever's in control, they're going to be the people who are going to benefit the most from those resources. But I guess I wanted to go to like the next elections is slated for 2023. And so right now, there has been a peace deal that has been brokered, but there's still internal conflicts. But over the last 10 years, 400,000 people have died as a result of the civil war, and over 1 million people have been displaced and are refugees as a result of this civil war. But right now, like, the talk is like the answer is making this transition from sort of the military, who has control over the current government, making this transition from military control to civilian control over the government. But at the end of the day, it's like, if that transition, I understand why that argument is made. But at the end of the day, we have many countries in Africa who have civilian control, and they're still being exploited for their resources. So I think there has to be a change in the economic and political structure and a relationship with foreign powers in order for them to really develop and all of the people of Southern Sudan to benefit.
Excuse the mist. It's not fire. um, yeah. I wanted to know your thoughts specifically on the fact that a lot of this has been led by civil society groups, because I have a lot of not to say that all of them are bad, but I have a lot of criticisms of the whole idea of civil society, this idea that, oh, these groups are going to push for democracy and everything. And a lot of the terminology that they use, a lot of the principles that they fight for, a lot of the we might have a difference of opinion on this, but something like, our number one priority is we want freedom of press, to me, like, that's nice, but realistically, like, when you're talking about a country that's trying to separate from Western imperialism, can you really have people who are going to be inside of your country writing things who are funded by the Western imperialists, writing things to disrupt the revolution? In my opinion, no. So, these groups that like are there, but they're kind of like on the front lines. It seems like their politics are very measured. Oh gosh, their politics are very measured. So I just wanted to know, like, your thoughts about that, like how, because that's one thing I was reading up on, like they play a major role as far as trying to organize the government. But I think that that's a big flaw in itself, because they're not necessarily there for an economic revolution. They're there basically to copycat, I would say, Western governments.
Yeah, and I think like that's going back to what I was talking about earlier, is that the problem is that you have these outside forces who are trying to recreate the societies that we see. We're trying to recreate Western societies. These societies, at the end of the day, like, we live in a colonial world, right? Like, at the end of the day, we're talking about colonialism, and so any recreation of the United States of America or Western states, you're talking about recreating the colonial state. And at the end of the day, the first priority should be to sever any dependency that you have on these foreign states. The next thing is like to be able to do that, you have to control your resources. So at the end of the day, when you talk about these civil societies coming in here, I'm looking at what Singapore, South Korea, Japan, how these countries were able to build their economies, right? And it had those countries are different because they didn't have like these several ethnic groups within their country for one, but also they were able to take on like their economies was like sort of state run. So there was, even though you could say, all right, it was dictatorial, but it was like state run. They were protecting their private businesses. They were protecting their industries, their markets. African countries are not being told to do anything like that. If anything, it's being told to open up their markets. You know what I'm saying? For Western institutions. So, like these African, at the end of the day, it's like they have to say, this is what we're going to do as African people or Southern Sudanese people or whatever country. And just like forget the outside influence. Our first priority is to control our economic institutions, build those economic institutions up. And we're going to do that by any means necessary, and look at themselves just like any nation that was building. They have to look at themselves as just one nation, and our first priority is to build up our nation economically and politically, and become a economic and political power.
Yeah, and I think like you said, like something very important as far as like the fact that terms like that are used to measure success post a revolution by the West, like they really don't mean success for us. So like you mentioned, opening up the economy, the way that the UN and WTO and the World Bank, like they act like, oh, having a open and liberalized economy, that's what we want. We want to have all these foreign investments, and we know, like, just from experience, if we think on our own and not like think based on what they're telling us is good for us, we know on our own experience that this is not good for us. Even like their measurements of a gross domestic product, like this is your GDP, that is not reflective of how the masses of Africans do inside of a country. So even countries like Nigeria that they say are a success, Nigeria is a very, very unequal society and has a very small bourgeoisie class that is in control. So, like going back to South Sudan, I think that a lot of the problems when we have countries, we have these coups, like, there's been a lot of coups lately, and there's always been, is that like, even whenever it seems like there's like a forward push, like positive push for the people, it's kind of being controlled, So what, I'm sure you heard that speech Kwame Ture said, like the terms that we're allowed to use, that's very important. Like how you measure your success is very important. If you're using your oppressor's terms and saying, oh, democratization and liberalization, rather than saying economic security, free and good healthcare, education system that is actually built for liberation. Like the terminologies that we use, I think are important. And so I think for our movements, that as we start removing these, Western puppets from power, like we have to have an emphasis on redefining what liberation means, and be unafraid whenever the West comes in and tells us that what we are aspiring to is not liberation. Because if you think about Cuba, for example, I looked at like Cuba, like, oh wow, like they really like got a setup there, like that's very, very, representative of the people. But how does the Western media label Cuba? They said that it's a closed society. They said people are doing horribly. They say that they can't, get all this property, and it's horrible. It's a horror story, So it's very important, just definitions and how we measure our own progress, how we measure freedom and liberation. That's going to be very important for us as we start seeing people being removed from power.
Yeah, I mean, Huey P. Newton told us, right? Power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. And that's what it is. And like we, when we're exercising, we exercise power. One of the things that we are doing is defining phenomena. We have to define what capitalism is, what democracy is, what socialism is, what liberty is, all of these things. And so it's important for us to really, make the world in our image. And that's the problem right there. It's like the world has been made in the Europeans' image, and this is what we are combating right now. I know we have to transition. I see the time, so I'm working. Let me see. Might have to read. Okay. I should have had the book. I just decided that I wanted to read from my copy of the book. I'm trying to see where I put it at. All right, so I'll read from, because my internet connection is off, so I'm working from my phones right now. But so yeah, we're gonna transition to our reading, but I want to encourage everybody, as usual, to get involved with We Charge Colonialism. We are constantly looking for more and more people to become members, to find out how they can be a part of this struggle to build these anti-colonial institutions. You can email us at info@wechargecolonialism.org, info@wechargecolonialism.org. Find out how you can be involved, whether it's social media, writing. We're always looking for writers, videographers. Is that the proper term for it? But hit us up, find out how you can get involved with our organization. Also visit our website, wechargecolonialism.org, to get more information or to read some of our articles, check out some of our videos, and see the work that we're doing. So again, we're going to transition. Is there anything that you want to raise, Tierney?
Nope, I think we're ready.
All right. So again, we're reading from chapter 1. Oh, yeah, I guess like Walter Rodney. I remember we had a discussion. We want to make sure that we big up these authors too that we're reading. Walter Rodney was a Guyanese historian and activist, a revolutionary, I'm gonna say. Walter Rodney was definitely, one of those academic revolutionaries, and we don't have many of those. And so, Walter Rodney was assassinated in 1980. Some people say that the president of Guyana at the time was involved in that assassination, and his primary motive being that Walter Rodney, being a Pan-Africanist and also a Marxist, he was waging a class struggle. And so the president felt threatened by Walter Rodney's at least advocacy of organizing the working class of Guyana into one political force. And so many people say like that was the motivation behind the assassination, where you had somebody who's holding the highest office in the land, seeing Walter Rodney as that much of a threat. He's also influenced by the Black Power movement as well. Very, very active. He was there in Zimbabwe, I think, when Zimbabwe gained its flag independence. Sorry, trying to go to the reading now. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Tim?
Just sorry, I didn't know I wasn't muted. Just that he was very much one of the figures in the Caribbean who became very vital to the Pan-Africanist struggle. And his shaping inside of this specific book of the argument as far as why Africa has not advanced is something that has inspired many, many people inside of our movement. And so ultimately, if we're trying to learn from the past, we're trying to learn why Africa is still in the condition it is in, that we have to educate ourselves as far as what analyses would have been made before we try to make new analyses. I see a lot of people who don't want to do the reading as far as what people have already uncovered for us, and they want to come in with a new analysis. But it's very vital that we go back and read from people who have already laid a great groundwork. So this is a very important book. When Ikemba said that we're going to this book next, I was like, great option, great choice. So I'm excited for us to see what we uncover.
All right. So we're going to get into it. All right. So I want to read those quotes to start us off. So chapter 1, some questions on development. In contrast with the surging growth of the countries in our socialist camp and the development taking place, albeit much more slowly, in the majority of the capitalist countries, is the unquestionable fact that a large proportion of the so-called underdeveloped countries are in total stagnation, and that in some of them the rate of economic growth is lower than that of population increase. These characteristics are not fortuitous. They correspond strictly to the nature of the capitalist system in full expansion, which transfers to the dependent countries the most abusive and barefaced forms of exploitation. It must be clearly understood that the only way to solve the questions now besetting mankind is to eliminate completely the exploitation of dependent countries by developed capitalist countries, with all the consequences that this implies. Che Guevara, 1964. Big up, Che. So, one, what is development? Development in human society is a many-sided process. At the level of the individual, it implies increased skill and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. Some of these are virtually moral categories and are difficult to evaluate depending as they do on the age in which one lives, one's class origins, and one's personal code of what is right and what is wrong. However, what is indisputable is that the achievement of any of those aspects of personal development is very much tied in with the state of the society as a whole. From earliest times, man found it convenient and necessary to come together in groups to hunt and for the sake of survival. The relations which develop within any given social group are crucial to an understanding of the society as a whole. Freedom, responsibility, skill, etc. have real meanings only in terms of the relations of men in society. Of course, each social group comes into contact with others. The relations between individuals in any two societies are regulated by the form of the two societies. Their respective political structures are important because the ruling elements within each group are the ones that begin to dialogue, trade or fight, as the case may be. At the level of social groups, therefore, development implies an increasing capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. Much of human history has been a fight for survival against natural hazards and against real and imagined human enemies. Development in the past has always meant the increase in the ability to guard the independence of the social group and indeed to infringe upon the freedom of others, something that often came about irrespective of the will of the persons within the societies involved. Men are not the only beings which operate in groups, but the human species embarked upon a unique line of development because man had the capacity to make and use tools. The very act of making tools was a stimulus to increase in rationality rather than a consequence of a fully mature intellect. In historical terms, man the worker was every bit as important as man the thinker because the work with tools liberated men from sheer physical necessity so that he can impose himself upon other more powerful species and upon nature itself. The tools with which men work and the manner in which they organize their labor are both important indices of social development. More often than not, the term development is used in an exclusive economic sense. The justification being that the type of economy is itself an index of other social features. What then is economic development? A society develops economically as its members increase jointly their capacity for dealing with the environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, on the extent to which they put that understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. Taking a long-term view, it can be said that there has been constant economic development within human society since the origins of man, because man has multiplied enormously his capacity to win a living from nature. The magnitude of man's achievement is best understood by reflecting on the early history of human society and noting firstly the progress from crude stone tools to the use of metals. Secondly, the changeover from hunting and gathering wild fruit to the domestication of animals and the growing of food crops. And thirdly, the improvement in the character of work from being an individualistic activity towards an activity which assumes a social character through the participation of many. Um, want to build on that before I move on?
Yeah. You want to go first, or?
Yeah, I mean, this right here, I think this is a good setup. Walter Rodney, man, this is what they call this sort of like big history now, which is like this sort of new movement. So when I'm reading this, I'm looking at and big history is like looking at history as a whole, starting from the Big Bang Theory. And I know he doesn't go that far, but you can sort of see like he's starting from prehistory though. And as a historian, most historians, well, not now, but like, historians traditionally start from written records. So I like his analysis as he's going back, looking at the development of human societies from the very beginning. And so he's like setting up too, like, and I guess like this is like that Marxism or dialectic approach, because he's setting that up, talking about how different human societies come in contact with each other. And the people who are the leaders of those societies, those people are going to come together and sort of like talk about the terms of this new relationship that's going to develop. And so it's bringing us to, he's going to bring us up to this relationship between Europeans and Africans, right? Coming together and how that relationship develops. But also he goes into how, he's starting to talk about how all human societies are developing too, because we're trying to find out ways to survive in our habitat, in our environment. So how we're creating tools and so forth. But I'm just this is like a setup right now that I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I also like you said, it's kind of like starting with the foundations of how we even view the world, which is very important because sometimes we assume things just based on, we're accustomed to this is what good is and this is what bad is, without necessarily understanding that a lot of the foundational pillars are things that have been instilled in us, not necessarily for our interests. So the point that he was making about the differences between Here you go. The differences between something as simple as elevating people who think versus people who work with their hands. And this is something that a lot of us don't even like think through. It's just kind of like automatically assumed. Oh, you're an intellectual. Oh, you must be better than someone who's a carpenter or someone who's a plumber or someone who does something with their hands. This is something that's kind of ingrained into our culture. Not understanding that a lot of the intellectual spaces don't have the ability to cross into the space of someone who does know how to get things done in a physical way. So a lot of these play directly, I think, into the ideals that we're taught as colonized people to celebrate certain things, even if it's not necessarily for the advancement of our societies. And it's true, like particularly in Africa, there was a difference of priorities prior to colonialism, and once we become ingrained into this culture, our priorities drastically shifted. And so now you see communities that are being ran by interests that go towards maintaining a status quo instead of truly decolonizing, which means understanding that the things that we've adopted were not for our good and not for our liberation, but were really for our captivity. So I like that we're starting foundationally to start questioning the principles by which this society was built on and that we've accepted without necessarily scrutinizing.
Right on, right on. So going on to the next paragraph, every people have shown the capacity for independently increasing their ability to live a more satisfactory life through exploiting the resources of nature. Every continent independently participated in the early epochs of the extension of man's control over his environment, which means in effect that every continent can point to a period of economic development. Africa, being the original home of man, was a major participant in a process in which human groups displayed an ever-increasing capacity to extract a living from the natural environment. Indeed, in the early period, Africa was the focus of the physical development of man as such, as distinct from other living beings. Development was universal because the conditions leading each economic expansion were universal. Everywhere man was faced with the task of survival by meeting fundamental material needs, and better tools were a consequence of the interplay between human beings and nature as a part of the struggle for survival. Of course, human history is not a record of advances and nothing else. There were periods in every part of the world when there was temporary setbacks and actual reduction of the capacity to produce the basic necessities and other services for the population. But the overall tendency was towards increased production, and at given points of time, the increase in the quantity of goods was associated with a change in the quality or character of society. This will be shown later with reference to Africa, but to indicate the universal application of the principle of quantitative/qualitative change, an example will be drawn from China. Early man in China lived at the mercy of nature and slowly discovered such basic things as the fact that fire can be man-made and the seeds of some grasses could be planted in the soil to meet food requirements. Those discoveries helped inhabitants of China to have simple farming communities using stone tools and producing enough for bare subsistence. That was achieved several thousand years before the birth of Christ or the flight of the Prophet Muhammad. The goods produced at that stage were divided more equally among the members of society who lived and worked in families. By the time of the Tang dynasty of the 7th century AD or CE, China had expanded its economic capacity not only to grow more food, but also to manufacture a wide variety of items such as silks, porcelain, ships, and scientific devices. This, of course, represented a quantitative increase in the goods produced, and it was interrelated with the qualitative changes in Chinese society. By the later date, there was a political state where before there were only self-government units. Instead of every family and every individual performing the tasks of agriculturalists, house builders, tellers, etc., there had arisen specialization of function. Most of the population still tilled the land, but there were skilled artisans who made silk and porcelain, bureaucrats who administered the state, and Buddhist and Confucian religious philosophers who specialized in trying to explain those things that lay outside of immediate understanding. Specialization and division of labor led to more production as well as inequality in distribution. A small section of Chinese society came to take a large disproportionate share of the proceeds of human labor. And that was the section which did least to actually generate wealth by working in agriculture or industry. They could afford to do so because grave inequalities had emerged in the ownership of the basic means of production, which was the land. Family land became smaller as far as most peasants were concerned, and the minority took over the greater portion of the land. Those changes in land tenure were part and parcel of development in its broadest sense. That is why development cannot be seen purely as an economic affair, but rather as an overall social process which is dependent upon the outcome of man's effort to deal with his natural environment. Um, through, through careful study, Through careful study, it is possible to comprehend some of the very complicated links between the changes in the economic base and changes in the rest of the superstructure of the society, including the sphere of ideology and social beliefs. The changeover from communalism in Asia and Europe led to the instance to codes of behavior peculiar to feudalism. The conduct of the European knights in armor had much in common with that of the Japanese samurai or warriors. They developed notions of so-called chivalry, conduct becoming a gentleman knight on horseback, while in contrast had to learn extreme humility, deference, and obsequiousness, symbolized by doffing his cap and standing bareheaded before his superiors. In Africa, too, it was to be found that the rise of the state and superior classes led to the practice whereby common subjects prostrated themselves in the presence of the monarchs and aristocrats. When the point had been reached, it became clear that the rough equality of the family had given way to a new state of society.
You going to Kimba?
Yeah, I mean, like right here again, I like this setup that's being given. This is not this analysis of the development of like these complex societies, and that's a history that we don't really look at, but we have to look at how we had egalitarian societies which weren't that much complex, because you had smaller groups of people, and really everybody contributed to. There wasn't any specialization, so everybody like contributed to the building of those societies and took on like whatever the needs were. Everybody took on those needs to keep that society going. But then as societies began to build and become more complex, and you see like urban cities starting to develop, you have more specialization. And with more specialization, these people are sort of being uplifted in the society now. And sort of you having like this, now you having class structures that are being designed as a result of this specialization. And so now you have these bureaucrats, you have the rise of aristocrats, and you have the rise also of like like this specialization even in the spiritual or religious realm. Preachers, he didn't use the term, but now you have like these preachers and bishops, later on the Pope, like people who are a part of that a higher class. So these people have like this level of respectability and authority within society, that's going to sort of like separate societies into these different classes. And so he's sort of like walking us through that, how that came about, how land began to be appropriated and being under the control of now a minority. And so now it's like the development of the dependency that's taking place in society. And so as I'm like reading that, I'm thinking about, I know he's talking about this underdevelopment that's taking place between external forces, but right here he's talking about the underdevelopment that's taking place internally, within the society. So I think like that's something that how we view this. We have to view this as the underdevelopment that's taking place in the eternal community. If that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like it's funny. First time I read this book, I remember like parts like this. I was like, oh my gosh, why are we going through all this history? Now I have like a different like mindset. I think because like so he's right now he's talking about China, and I've actually been doing a lot of like going back and like reevaluation of China just because of their history. Like at one point they were literally, just like anywhere else where Europe was, they were a colonized region. The people were impoverished overwhelmingly, and they were controlled by Western interests. And here you go today, where China's basically has the United States shaking right now, like to where, Joe Biden said, well, we're going to enter into a new Cold War with China. This would not have ever been foreseeable at a different time. And so now you have to like go back and study, how did this country that was once like insignificant, powerless, now become the biggest threat to this big international giant? And going back and studying the foundations of the society are very important for that reason. So I'm actually just listening and like thinking about how this experience relates directly to the African experience, because the society, the communal setup is very similar to what we were prior to being a colonized people. So I think definitely what you were saying, there's a lot we can pick up if we're willing to take that a political analysis. I think sometimes, particularly in the Pan-Africanist world, we don't want to study outside of Africa. And that's a big limitation, I think, that we're having, because realistically speaking, there's no African territory that I think we could really say, oh, you now are the threat to Western dominance. And so what we have to do is study what other people did or didn't do, and what the conditions they were dealt with, if we're going to now try to have the same type of impact and be the same type of threat to the globalists who are trying to maintain control over the African continent.
Yeah, and I think also too, I'm not sure if goes into it, but when we look at how these different societies are developing, we have to look at the environment as well, that's having an impact on the setup, like the institutions that are going to develop within those societies, and then also how it impacts not only the structure of those societies, but also like the mindset of the people in those societies. Like when you go to Europe, for instance, like they were set up in small egalitarian sort of communities prior to contact with the Romans. You had these small communities that were very like these war clans that were constantly in conflict with each other, because they were in an environment that was like really not, conducive to agriculture. You talk about scarce resources, like Europe was like one of those places where resources were scarce. So they were very like warlike. And I think like that really has an influence on even like today, just the mindset and mentality that they have. And that mixed in with the Romans, who came in there and showed them how to really like structure a state and dominate, other groups, because they took that sort of format and was like, shit, we're going to do this, around the world. And so they took it. And I think like what really gave them an advantage, not an advantage, but if you could, I guess you could maybe look at it as an advantage, but it was like the damn near, they were on the brink of, dying out. They weren't able to like trade, with the East because of, the Crusades, the war that was taking place between them and Islam. So it was just a lot. So they was out of desperation. They was like, hey, we better come up with another plan. But yeah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very true. I think when you look at the mentality of Western civilization, they act like they have something to lose. That's why they are literally everywhere. They're inside of everyone's affairs. They're listening to all conversations. They're listening to this conversation because they understand that scarcity coming out from those conditions have them realizing that they could easily be in a position where the global South starts demanding control of their resources, in which they would lose all the power and influence that they've gained by colonialism and by exploitation. And taking it back to China, I also think that the history of China has to do a lot with why, how they've kind of got their way like out of their condition from being an impoverished people, because I think like, one, like China's a huge territory, and they were controlled and conquered, by Japan, a small island. And the Japanese, if you don't know, were very barbaric and during their occupation of China. Those conditions, I think, lead directly to what you see today. That is, a people who understand that they have to essentially out-organize their oppressor, and they had done it slowly to the point where they, organized effectively to be a threat to the globalists. And we have to learn similarly. We have to, as African people, keep in mind the threat the environment has done, the things that the environment has done to our people. But I think the difference is with our people in Africa, it's so like abstract. Like, where exactly has our oppression, or where exactly has this condition, who do we attribute it to? And that's one of the effects of neocolonialism. It hides the oppressor's actions, it hides the agenda, and it makes everything look like, oh, we're trying to be there for your good, where they're really not there for our good. So that's what I think has a lot to do with educating and having us be aware of who is responsible for our conditions. Because I think when we have that continental-wide understanding, you're going to see a very different Africa and different political organizations, because you're not going to see political organizations that want to fit into the global scheme when they realize that the global scheme is exactly the same thing that's oppressing Africans. So the conditions, yes, I absolutely agree. The conditions are so telling as far as like how we adjust and how we move today. And you see like Ethiopians, even like something simple like how triggered white people are, like when you say like some basic stuff, like, if you say something like, Black power, they'll be like, oh, Black power, oh, that's like white power, that's racist. That's a triggered person because they realize their position. When you say things like, oh, we're going to, control our communities, what do you mean? Why you need control? Oh, we're all in this together. What's wrong with you? These are people who are triggered because they know that they're in a very scarce situation. So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, for sure. Like the next paragraph is pretty long. I'm just going to go back to this other. I know it's 1057. Let me read this real quick though. I'm going back to like 10 page. I'm page 10 on the PDF. Last paragraph. Specialization and division of labor led to more production, as well as inequality and distribution. A small section of Chinese society came to take a large, disproportionate share of the proceeds of human labor, and that was the section which did least to actually generate wealth by working in agriculture or industry. I think I wanted to go back to that point just to think about even today, in the colonial structure, colonial capitalist structure, those people who are doing the least work, like these people in these positions of power, are the ones who control the majority of the wealth, while the working class is like struggling or has control over a small amount of wealth. And I think like he's speaking to that dynamic that existed, and that dynamic is being developed in those early structures. And so it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Is just like, these institutions we have today is a different form of what existed, even prior to the development of colonial capitalism. But for the sake of time, is there anything that you want to say before we close out?
Nah, I think you can take it away.
All right. Yeah, wish we had a little bit more time trying to squeeze everything in, but it's all good. I think we had a great discussion. And actually, next Saturday, we will be off. I know I didn't communicate with you, but I had to go to Atlanta. I'm going to be down there. So yeah, so our next podcast of Book Club will be after this Saturday at 10 a.m. And we'll continue this reading of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. I want to appreciate everybody for tuning in. And just remember, visit our website and find out how you can join and be a part of We Charge Colonialism. So again, appreciate you for tuning in, and peace.
Peace out.